Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. It is April 18th, a Thursday here. I am your host, Tommy Brzee, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit more about that Super League that we talked more about last week mainly, but the pitch deck for that proposal has come out, so more details about exactly what the divisions would look like, exactly what NIL would look like under the structure. So want to make sure I break all that down for you all today. Then we have a little bit of an NFL draft update for you guys. It feels like things are starting to get a little bit more solidified with only a week to go till the big day. So want to break down all of that as well as who you will see on Thursday at draft day. And then we're going to get into some unsung heroes of the top teams in the country. A guy, David Kenyon, over at the Bleacher Report did a very interesting article where he gave his 10 for the top 10 teams. I figured I would follow suit and give my 10 and kind of compare the two. And then finally, we have another Hot Take Thursday, and it's about this portal window and who I think is going to be coming out of it feeling the best about what they did over those 2 weeks. But before we jump into all that, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question or comment on the screen, I can read it out loud, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCPodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have kind of a fun, interactive experience here. Maybe call me out on something that I didn't quite cover enough. Maybe ask a question that you're wondering. So anything you want to do, you can use that link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCPodcast.net. But let's jump right in. The Super League has been something that has been talked about quite a bit. And there's been a little bit of kind of hypotheticals or theories of what this might look like, what the practice might look like at the end of the day, and we haven't really had a firm idea of what we're looking at. But recently, the pitch deck, or technically like the proposal that was being circulated around college football last week from College Sports Today, has officially come out. Sportico has obtained the quote-unquote confidential pitch deck that is circulated around like mid-February was when it really started kind of getting out there. This kind of breaks down a ton of different things, including a specific plan for broadcast revenue for players, a 40-game spring football festival, they're calling it, and then a primary look at the 70 members and how they kind of would be arranged. So obviously, this is going to be a very interesting thing to look at over the next little bit. I've been pretty open about the idea that I think this is not necessarily an imminent thing in college football, but definitely something to keep your eye on as we go on throughout the time. So might as well get an idea of what it looks like. So this 11-page deck, which was titled Competitive Equity Proposals, which was essentially just a fancy way to say we're trying to even the playing field here. It was presented by a search firm that works extensively in college athletics. One of their big-time people over at Turnkey ZRG is a part of College Sports Tomorrow, so it makes sense why they were involved in this transaction. And it's going to be really interesting to see this kind of unfold. I'm not exactly sure if this is, the end-all, be-all for all of this. I tend to believe there will be some ers and ahs or some adjustments added throughout this thing, but let's just give you an idea of what the pitch was and kind of some merits of it, some not so great things about it, and so on. But let's start with some interesting things with the divisions, because I feel like that's what everyone is probably the most focused on, right? I think everyone really wants to know where their team lands, who they're going to be playing every year, how it's going to set up for their schedule and for their division. And it seems like they're going all regional for the most part. So you look at the West, it's mainly kind of the Pac-10, the teams that we've seen out there for quite some time. It would bring some of the teams that have just abandoned ship back to that side of the equation, which would be a very interesting thing to watch, as well as the Southwest Conference being reintroduced is a huge thing. I mean, you have these games, Arkansas and Texas and Oklahoma. People don't really fully understand how big of rivalries those can be. Texas Tech and A&M is another one that I think has kind of fallen by the wayside, obviously, as A&M has moved on to the SEC, but there's some hate there, and there definitely will be when they get on the field if this does come to fruition, because this is a fun group of teams that all of them hate each other just insane amounts. So I think this conference in particular, it's one that I've talked about a little bit. I would love to be in college football again because of that reason. I think they have so much history, they have so much hatred for each other, and they're right around the same area. I mean, you're pretty much entirely, actually. It's Arkansas, it's Oklahoma, and it's Texas. So you're right there. You know people that are fans of all these teams. This is my favorite hypothetical conference in the country for sure. And then you have a new one called the Plains division, which would be kind of a hodgepodge of some Big 12 teams up top here. You see Colorado, Iowa State, Iowa, Kansas, BYU, some other teams. So it's kind of a Big 10, Big 12 kind of hybrid here. I think this makes sense in terms of geography. It would definitely be one of the probably lighter divisions if you look at these kind of comparatively. But I think overall, when you look at these, for the most part at least, they're split pretty evenly. There are some that have those top level teams where others don't, but at the end of the day, there's plenty of talent across all of these divisions. But you get over to the Midwest, and it's mainly kind of the Big Ten teams. You add in Missouri, which is kind of a fun little thing to add in there. You add in Louisville, you add in Cincinnati. So definitely a couple of teams to add in, but it's mainly the Big Ten teams and then the teams just right around there geographically. Northeast would be a very interesting one. You'd have Boston College, Maryland. This is kind of more of a hodgepodge. You have some ACC teams, you have some Big Ten teams. Notre Dame finally finds their way into some type of division or conference under this model. They would absolutely have to under this model, which might be another hurdle for them to get over, but we'll get to that as that kind of comes to fruition. The Southeast Conference is mostly ACC, a little bit of SEC here and there. You have Florida's in there. You have, I guess they're the only SEC team in there, but you have a ton of ACC teams here. You have UCF right there. So this is a really solid conference overall. I mean, you have Clemson, you have Florida State, you have Florida, who, in my personal opinion, is not necessarily in the best place currently, but is always that school that can get onto the national scene fairly quickly whenever they need to. You add people like North Carolina, South Carolina, another SEC team in here. So tons to watch in that one. And then the South Conference is pretty much the SEC, at least the SEC of old. You add Georgia Tech back into the mix over at the SEC, and I think there are some people that have totally forgotten that there were times when Georgia Tech was not only in the SEC, but one of the best teams in the SEC. They were playing Auburn every single year. That was a big-time rivalry. Obviously, Georgia was one, but there's so many great games that I think would be kind of reintroduced here that we obviously, people my age never really got to see, but at the end of the day, would absolutely love to see it. I think Georgia Tech joining these teams that are right around their area instead of having to travel up to Syracuse, New York, and deal with that is definitely a little bit easier, and definitely I think would add to the mystique of this conference at least a little bit. But when you look up and down, it's just littered with guys. So Alabama, Georgia, LSU, tons of other teams are kind of making their way up when you talk about Ole Miss and Tennessee. So it's going to be a really interesting conference. I think that's obviously the toughest conference because they're pulling from the SEC the most. But then we get to the underleague, and the underleague is what we're calling the kind of the promotion relegation league that we've talked about, full of group of 5 teams. So it would have been, in their proposal, at least for the first year, would have been Boise State, James Madison, Liberty, Miami of Ohio, New Mexico State, Toledo, Troy, Tulane, UNLV, and UTSA. So all the teams that did really well last year kind of either went to their conference championship or won it, and kind of, were the best teams in the group of 5 last year. So the divisions are kind of the super interesting thing here. I think it's what everyone's kind of watching throughout this time. But let's get to kind of the rest of what's going on with this. And I think one of the big things that is going to be a huge topic of conversation as this goes over, the million number of eyes that it needs to get approved is the NIL structure. And it's something that people have been looking for a structure for quite some time. And it feels like they have somewhat of a grasp on what they're trying to do. So, realistically, the NIL pool will be called the football player pool, and it would be a collectively bargained type setup with the Super League TV money. So it would be really interesting to see how all of this kind of unfolds. But the way they're kind of saying it right now is 5% would go to all rostered freshmen, 15% to sophomores, 30% to juniors, and 50% to seniors or graduate students. So obviously a huge chunk of the pie. If you are willing to stay into your senior year, you get, half of those profits from those TV deals and everything like that. So it would be really interesting to see how this kind of develops. I think it's something that we'll definitely be watching. And another thing that people have talked about a lot is a roster cap, is some type of salary cap on NIL, and they would have that in this. So it would be really interesting to see not only, what that number is, but how that number can kind of be manipulated. As we've seen in professional sports, these roster or these salary caps can be manipulated in different ways, and it'll be interesting to see if that makes its way down to the college football level as we get a little bit further into this. But one of the interesting things that I've noticed in talking about this NIL cap is the school, if, quote unquote, or if the school exceeds the cap for a season, they could be punished by losing transfer slots and possibly losing scholarship spots. So it could be that maybe some teams are willing to take that risk to get the right guys on campus. Some teams definitely won't be willing to do that because of the depth issues they might have. But at the end of the day, it'll be really interesting to see if how much is that penalty? Is that penalty worth taking for a year while you go for a title instead of, leaving things on the table? But all of that is obviously a little bit in the future. And then on the other hand, one of the interesting things was if you fall below 80% of the pre-established NIL roster floor is what they're calling it, for 2 consecutive seasons, you'd be moved down to the underleague. So it's kind of this idea that if you can't support yourself financially to the extent of these other schools, these other 70 teams that are totally safe, you would then become a team that is not totally safe, which is a very interesting concept. It's something that definitely benefits the big dogs around town, the guys that have insane amounts of NIL money rolling in pretty much every day. But at the end of the day, I think there has to be some type of system in place for how NIL works, and I think this is something that at the very least gives you an idea of what the future will look like, what your team will look like, and how you can go about business. So, and it's something that doesn't exist right now. So it'll be really interesting to see how things kind of roll with this. I think there will be some tweaks to that, if I'm being totally honest, just because I think there are some freshmen coming in that probably deserve a little bit more than 5%, but also there are some guys that might be kind of demanding more than 5%. And I think it's a very good idea to kind of spread that out just a little bit more evenly. Now, I very much want them to benefit the older guys because that's what I want in college football. I want as many guys graduating. I want as many guys playing into their senior years as possible. So definitely keep the, stepping stones, I guess, as you go up throughout college football, getting more and more of that revenue. But I think the steps will be a little bit closer together, I guess, as we get closer to this possibly becoming a thing. But let's get to scheduling here for a second. And the way it's proposed in this pitch deck is a 14-game regular season over 15 weeks. So you get one bye week in the middle of that 14-game schedule. Be a lot of football, there's no two ways about that, but the regular season would conclude on Thanksgiving weekend and will be followed up by a 16-team league playoff, which we've talked about a little bit, but it would be 8 teams that win all of the divisions and then the 8 teams that have the best record after that. So I've talked a little bit about how the competitive balance of scheduling might be a little bit tough to figure out, but at the end of the day, that's the way they're setting it up for the time being. It looks like they are looking to grow to 24 teams at some point, so that'll definitely be something to watch. It could be something that at the end of the day, once this officially gets approved, it's at 24 teams, but it'll be interesting to see how this kind of develops. I think the most interesting part of all of this has nothing to do with fall football, in my opinion. When you look at the deck, it says they have something called the College Football Spring Festival, and it would be 40 games played by the Super League each April, and these games would have concerts, auxiliary events, they would have tons of different things going on around the game, so kind of a super spring day almost in this world that this Super League is proposing, and it gives me kind of that live golf vibes, right? You have music blaring, you have people doing pretty much anything but watching golf. But at the end of the day, I suppose if it's a way to give, a fun experience for the fans out there in the spring, and maybe even play a team that's not the team that been playing for the past 3 months. Maybe you play someone else within the Super League. I think it's an interesting idea at the very least. Although I think there will be a lot of people that will be not too excited about that idea because it resembles those, live in that type of new era in sports, sort of. But at the end of the day, it's kind of a fun way to get everyone involved in a time when I think a lot of people are itching for college football. So that'll be really interesting. And then finally, I think the topic of conversation going on right now, and a big part of this pitch is going to be the transfer portal. And that's something that it feels like they have a very, very concrete plan, at least, of how roster management will work and everything like that. So you have 85 roster spots each year. That's just the way that they had pitched it in this. And they could give 70 scholarship slots. So this would take down the number of roster spots. This would take down the number of scholarship slots on a team, which would be very interesting. I'm not sure how they would be able to pull that off, but it'll be interesting to see if that number balloons a little bit, if it is taken back a little bit. Who knows? But the interesting part about this is at least of the 50 of those need to go to players that were recruited into your program directly out of high school. So this is fully benefiting the idea that you need to be recruiting high school. You can't leave high school kids out to dry because you want the experienced kid from another college. So you can't just do sort of the Colorado way of things and totally just flip over a roster by only transfer portal kids. You have to have some of your high school kids in there, and then each year you would have the ability to... Oh, one of the very interesting things in here that I just skipped over was athletes would have the ability to transfer twice in a 5-year eligibility window. So they wouldn't have this ability to, have 3 teams on their resume or 4 teams on their resume. At most, or I guess they could have 3 teams, but at most it would be 3 teams, and that would have to happen over that 5-year eligibility window. It would be interesting to see. I think that would definitely encourage kids to stay put and kind of stick it out where they are, because you got 5 years, and learning a defense, learning an offense, and kind of working your way into it is probably a better idea than bouncing around, having to relearn something, and then hoping it just all works out. So it'll be really interesting to see how that affects it. Each year there will be portal windows, what they call an open one in February, which is where it should be already, and then a supplemental window in March, which would essentially just be any kind of lingering guys out there that you might want to attack. You can do that in March, and you can sign a maximum of 10 players during each of those cycles. So it'll be really interesting to see how the strategy, I suppose, of recruiting, especially transfer portal recruiting, would go on during those months. Some guys would go up to the entire 10, some would go closer to 5 or 4, pretty much kind of the way of things right now. But then you would have to work out the roster spots on the back end. You would have to either give more to high school kids or figure out a way to, balloon that number a little bit higher. So it's a lot of different strategy that would have to be brought into play when you talk about recruiting, especially in the transfer portal in this era. And one of the very interesting things in here is if a player was to transfer to another school, the school that he is transferring to would have to pay a player transfer payment to the school that he is transferring from. So this is not unlike the NFL compensatory draft picks, that type of thing. So it's a very interesting thing to think about when you're taking on a kid. You already have to probably give him a certain amount of NIL money. Now you got to send a little bit of money over to whatever school he's coming from. So it's a very interesting idea, and I think it'll be wild to watch this kind of develop, even, this proposal develop over the next little bit. But I think it'll be really, really interesting to see all of this unfold. I think all of this is going to be very fluctuating, if I had to imagine. But to be totally honest, this NIL structure is really, the transfer portal structure is really kind of where they have my attention the most. I think this is something that is actually in the benefit of the sport, is actually in the benefit of the kids, and puts them in a position where they think, a little bit more thoroughly before making those decisions, like to leave a program or which program to join. So I think it's a really interesting thing that among all of this stuff, there's some popular stuff in here. There's some stuff I think needs a little bit of tweaking, but the transfer portal stuff I think is very, very intriguing, and I think would give, at the very least, some college coaches a peace of mind when they're going into this time of year, and definitely make their life a little bit less stressful than it is right now. But I've said plenty of times that I think this will take a fair amount of time to get some real traction. Obviously, the SEC and the Big Ten have very little reason to come to the table right now. You're going to have ESPN and Fox involved as well. So there's still a little ways down the road. But if I'm being totally honest, I do think there's a reality where we get to a point in the sport, especially if, the transfer portal and NIL keep going down this hill and keep snowballing the way they have. I think there's a real reality where everyone just kind of looks around and tries to find an answer for the sport just being stable. And if the Super League is there with a proposal ready to go, I think they could be at the front of the table. So it'll be really interesting to see this unfold. I think for the time being, everyone's kind of skeptical, watching from a distance type of thing. But I think as we get, further and further down the road, the Super League proposal gets more and more eyes on it, I think, and more people kind of start to think maybe this isn't the worst thing in the world. But we'll keep you updated with that as we go on, but we're going to take our first break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about the draft. We are only a week out from the NFL draft and wanted to make sure I broke down everything that you guys need to know going into next week. There's tons of movement in the first round. There's a little bit of solidification towards the top, but the back end is a little bit crazy. So we will break that down right after this, so stick with us.